Hello everyone and welcome. Find a comfortable spot, perhaps with a cup of tea, because today we are going to journey back in time. We will step quietly into one of history's most private, sacred, and terrifying rooms, the medieval birthing chamber. The woman in labor is called the travailing woman, for her body is on a journey, a travail in the old sense of the word, a torturous effort. She is both a vessel of creation and a warrior in a silent, personal battle. Let's consider the story of Ignaz Semmelweis, a 19th century Hungarian doctor. Though he lived long after the medieval period, his discovery is the final, crucial piece in understanding why childbed fever was so rampant. Semmelweis observed that the mortality rate in the doctor's maternity ward was 5 times higher than in the midwife's ward. He theorized that doctors were carrying cadaverous particles from the autopsy room to the delivery room on their unwashed hands. The fundamental misunderstanding of female anatomy was a primary driver of the horror in the medieval birthing chamber. Physicians of the era, relying on ancient texts from Galen who dissected animals, operated under a set of beliefs that seem utterly bizarre to us today. They imagined the uterus as having 7 chambers for bearing multiple offspring, or as having 2 distinct horns, one for male fetuses and one for females. One of the most terrifying complications was a retained placenta. After the baby is born, the uterus must contract again to expel the afterbirth. If this fails to happen, the placenta remains attached, preventing the uterus from clamping down and stopping the bleeding. This is a direct path to a fatal postpartum hemorrhage. The medieval midwife had a terrifying arsenal of folk remedies for this. The concept of childbed fever, or puerperal sepsis, was the great invisible monster of the birthing room. While they could see the horror of an obstructed labor or a hemorrhage, this killer was a ghost. A woman could have a perfectly normal delivery, feel well for a few days, and then suddenly develop a raging fever, chills, severe abdominal pain, and a foul-smelling discharge. Within days, she would be dead from an overwhelming systemic infection. They had no idea what caused it. The social ritual of the gossip's feast, or the groaning party, was a vital part of the postpartum period. After the ordeal was over and the mother was resting, her female companions would gather to celebrate the survival and the new arrival. It was a moment of profound female bonding, a shared exhalation of relief. They would consume a special drink called a caudle, a rich, warm concoction of wine or ale, eggs, sugar, and spices. Let us delve into the midwife's oath, a fascinating document that reveals her complex role. In many towns, midwives had to be licensed and sworn in by a bishop or a town official. This oath required her to be diligent in her duties, to serve both rich and poor without favoritism, and not to charge exorbitant fees. Crucially, she had to swear not to use any form of witchcraft, sorcery, or incantations, a clear indication of the suspicion that often surrounded her work. The fear of twins was immense. In a world without ultrasound, a twin pregnancy was a complete surprise until the moment of delivery. The birth of the first twin would be followed, not by the placenta, but by the feet or hands of a second baby. This was often seen as a monstrous or unnatural event, and it carried a significantly higher risk. The uterus would be overdistended, leading to weaker contractions and a longer, more exhausting labor. Consider the case of a transverse lie, where the baby is positioned horizontally across the uterus. For a medieval midwife, this was a nightmare scenario. There was simply no way for the baby to be born in this position. The midwife's only hope was a procedure called an internal podalic version. This involved reaching deep into the uterus, finding the baby's feet, and manually turning the entire fetus into a breech, feet first, positioned so it could be pulled out. The complete lack of any effective pain relief is a cornerstone of the horror. We must imagine a pain that is not only intense but also relentless, lasting not for minutes or hours, but sometimes for days on end. The only remedies available were mild herbal sedatives, which did little to touch the agony of uterine contractions, or prayer and psychological distraction. The swaddling of newborns, while considered essential, had its own set of dangers. The tight bindings could, if applied incorrectly, restrict circulation or even cause hip dysplasia. But the greatest danger was neglect. A swaddled baby was immobile and quiet. It was common practice for a peasant mother, who had to return to work in the fields soon after birth, to hang the swaddled infant from a hook on the wall or a branch of a tree to keep it safe from animals or from being trodden on. Her gossips, her closest female kin and friends, surround her. They are her support, her chorus of encouragement. Their presence is a shield, their collective experience a fragile armor against the unknown dangers that lie ahead for their sister. The religious ceremony of churching was a mandatory rite of passage for new mothers. Approximately 40 days after giving birth, a woman was expected to present herself at the church for a ritual of purification and thanksgiving. She would be met at the church door by the priest, who would sprinkle her with holy water and lead her inside to the altar. The psychological impact on the male surgeon called to perform an embryotomy must also be considered. This was a man, often a barber with experience in bloodletting and minor surgery, who was only ever summoned in the most desperate and gruesome of circumstances. He was the last resort, the harbinger of death for the infant. The procedure itself was a blind, bloody, and brutal affair. The economic vulnerability of a widow with children was extreme. If a woman's husband died, she was often left in a precarious position. While she might inherit some property, her rights were often limited, especially if she had no male children. A widow with young children to support was a common sight in medieval society, and she often faced a stark choice between destitution and a swift remarriage. If a woman died in childbirth, her children faced an even more uncertain future. Let's discuss the concept of maternal impression in more detail. This was the widespread belief that the thoughts, emotions, and experiences of a pregnant woman could directly imprint themselves onto her unborn child. If she was frightened by a dog, the child might be born with a dog-like birthmark or a fearful disposition. If she craved strawberries and couldn't get them, the baby might have a strawberry-shaped mark. This belief placed an enormous psychological burden on women. The birthing chamber of a queen was a place of intense political theater. When a queen went into labor, the kingdom held its breath. The stakes were astronomically high. The production of a healthy male heir could secure a dynasty and prevent civil war. The birth of a daughter could be a deep disappointment, while a stillbirth was a national tragedy. The room would be filled not just with midwives and female relatives, but with high-ranking nobles and officials who acted as official witnesses. The physical space of the lying-in chamber was carefully constructed. It was typically the best room in the house, dark, quiet, and kept very warm. Tapestries would be hung on the walls for insulation and to block drafts. The floor would be covered with sweet-smelling herbs and rushes. All of this was designed to create a stable, womb-like environment for the mother's recovery. She was to remain in bed, fed a special restorative diet, and attended to by other women. The midwife's hands were her most important tools, but her knowledge of the body's exterior was also crucial. She would palpate the abdomen to try and assess the baby's size and position, although this was an imprecise art. She would look for signs of impending labor, and she would monitor the nature of the vaginal discharge. Her knowledge was entirely sensory and empirical. She learned by watching, touching, and listening. The moment of quickening, when a mother first feels the fetus move, usually around the 4th or 5th month, was a moment of profound legal and religious significance. Before quickening, the fetus was not generally considered to have a soul or be fully alive. An early miscarriage was a sad event, but not the death of a person. After quickening, however, the fetus was believed to be ensouled. Let us consider the impact of class. While childbirth was dangerous for all women, wealth could provide certain advantages, but also unique dangers. A noblewoman would have better nutrition, a warmer room, and access to more experienced midwives and expensive remedies. However, she was also more likely to be attended by a male physician who, as we've discussed, might bring with him the risk of infection from other patients or from the dissecting room. The spiritual comfort offered by the church was a vital coping mechanism. In a world with so little physical control over the outcome, Faith provided a powerful framework for meaning and hope. The belief that saints were interceding on one's behalf, that suffering had a redemptive purpose, and that a child who died would be safe in heaven provided immense psychological solace. Tied around her belly, she might wear a birth girdle, a long scroll of parchment or silk, inscribed with prayers and holy names, a physical appeal to the saints for a safe delivery and a living child, a sacred talisman against mortality. The placenta itself was an object of fascination and folklore. It was often called the second self, or co-walker of the child. Its condition was thought to foretell the child's health and future. After it was delivered, the midwife would carefully examine it. A healthy-looking placenta was a good omen. It was then disposed of with great care. Burying it was a common practice, and the location was chosen deliberately. Burying it under a strong tree was thought to ensure the child grew up strong. The concept of modesty created significant challenges. Even within the all-female space of the birthing chamber, a woman's body was expected to be kept covered as much as possible. A midwife often had to work by touch alone under a sheet, without a clear view of what was happening. This was especially true if a male surgeon was called. The story of Saint Margaret of Antioch provides a powerful insight into the medieval female psyche regarding childbirth. According to her legend, Margaret was swallowed by a dragon while imprisoned for her Christian faith. However, the crucifix she carried irritated the dragon's insides, and it miraculously expelled her, unharmed. This story became a potent allegory for childbirth. The dragon's belly was the womb, and Margaret's safe emergence was the model for a successful delivery. Illegitimacy carried a heavy stigma, and the midwife was often caught in the middle of it. The birth of a child outside of marriage was a source of great shame for the mother and her family. The midwife had a legal and religious duty to try and persuade the mother to name the father, so that he could be held financially responsible for the child's upbringing. The sheer physical exhaustion of a prolonged labor was a killer in itself. A labor that stretched on for 2, 3, or even more days would completely deplete a woman's strength. She would become dehydrated and unable to push effectively. The uterus itself would become exhausted, and contractions would weaken and stop, a condition called uterine inertia. In this state, the woman was trapped. She had no energy left to expel the baby, and there were no effective means of intervention. The lack of understanding about the importance of hydration and nutrition during labor was a critical failure. A laboring woman was often given little to eat or drink, partly because of the belief that a full stomach could interfere with the birth, and partly because vomiting was common. This meant that during the most intense physical exertion of her life, she was being deprived of the very fuel and fluids she needed to sustain her. Let's reconsider the cesarean section. While almost always a post-mortem procedure, there are a few scattered, apocryphal accounts of women surviving it. The most famous is the story of Jacob Neufer, a Swiss pig gelder, who in the year 1500 supposedly performed the operation on his own wife after she had been in labor for days and had been given up for dead by the local midwives. The story claims that she survived and went on to have several more children naturally. The transition from swaddling to more freedom of movement for infants was a very slow process, driven by the new ideas of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Philosophers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued for a more natural approach to child-rearing. They condemned swaddling as a form of imprisonment that was unhealthy for a child's body and spirit. The role of the father during childbirth was one of anxious waiting. He was completely excluded from the birthing chamber, which was the exclusive domain of women. He would wait elsewhere in the house or at a nearby tavern with male friends, praying and awaiting news. His only role was to be informed of the outcome. This exclusion meant that men had very little understanding of the realities of childbirth. The belief in demonic influence was not just a general anxiety, it was a specific diagnostic tool. If a labor was particularly difficult and unnatural, it could be blamed on a demonic curse or possession. The midwife might look for signs of witchcraft, and in some cases, an exorcism might be attempted on the laboring woman. This transformed a medical crisis into a spiritual one. The boundary between the physical and the spiritual is porous here. A difficult birth is not just a medical problem. It is a sign of sin, a spiritual blockage, a battle being waged for the souls of both mother and child. The disposal of the afterbirth and any blood-soaked linens was a matter of great concern. It was believed that a witch could use these materials to cast a spell on the mother or child. Therefore, they had to be disposed of secretly and carefully, usually by burning or by burying them deep in the ground. This practice, born of superstition, had an unintended hygienic benefit. The sensory experience of the medieval birthing room is worth contemplating. The dominant sounds would be the mother's cries, the rhythmic prayers of her attendants, and the crackling of the fire. The dominant smells would be a complex mixture of wood smoke, sweat, blood, amniotic fluid, and the strong scent of boiled herbs like lavender or rosemary. The light would be dim and flickering, cast by a single candle or the hearth, creating deep shadows that danced on the walls. The mortality of infants in the first month of life, the neonatal period, was exceptionally high. Many babies who survived the ordeal of birth would succumb in the following days or weeks. The causes were numerous. Tetanus, contracted through the unhygienic cutting of the umbilical cord, was a common and horrific killer, causing painful muscle spasms. Diarrheal diseases from contaminated water or food were rampant. Respiratory infections were also frequent in cold, damp homes. Let us look at the legal framework surrounding a midwife's failure. If a midwife was deemed to be negligent or incompetent, she could face legal consequences. Families could bring complaints against her to town councils or ecclesiastical courts. If she was found guilty of malpractice, she could be fined, publicly shamed, or have her license to practice revoked. The physical toll on a woman who survived multiple births was immense. Each pregnancy and birth put a huge strain on the body. A woman who had 10 or 12 pregnancies, which was not uncommon, would likely suffer from a range of chronic ailments. Prolapsed organs, where the uterus or bladder sags into the vagina due to weakened pelvic floor muscles, were a common and miserable condition. Chronic back pain, varicose veins, and hemorrhoids were near universal complaints. The transition to the use of forceps was a turning point, but it was a slow and controversial one. After the Chamberlain family's secret was finally revealed in the 18th century, the design was improved and the instrument slowly came into wider use. However, many traditional midwives were deeply suspicious of these new male-controlled metal instruments. They preferred their own trusted hands. Early forceps were also dangerous tools in unskilled hands. The religious significance of the number 40 is why the lying-in and churching period was typically 40 days. This number echoes throughout the Bible: the 40 days of flood, the 40 years the Israelites wandered in the desert, and the 40 days Christ spent in the wilderness. It is a number associated with periods of trial, purification, and transition. By structuring the postpartum period around this number, the church imbued it with a deep spiritual meaning. The sheer noise of a medieval town or village would filter into the birthing chamber, a constant reminder of the outside world. The ringing of church bells, the clatter of carts on cobblestones, the shouts of merchants, the lowing of animals, all of this would be part of the auditory landscape. At times, this noise might be a comfort, a sign of normal life continuing. At other times, especially during a difficult labor, it might be an intrusion. Imagine the moment a midwife realized a labor was obstructed. This would be a moment of dawning, sickening terror. The initial optimism and encouragement would give way to a grim understanding that something was fundamentally wrong. The baby was not descending, despite hours or even days of strong contractions. The mother was becoming exhausted, her cries weaker. The midwife had used all her skills, changing the mother's position, giving her herbal remedies, massaging her belly, and nothing had worked. The food and drink given to a woman during her lying-in period were specifically chosen for their supposed restorative properties. She would be fed a diet rich in heating and moistening foods to counteract the rigors of birth. This included things like rich broths, bread soaked in wine, eggs, and roasted meats. The celebratory drink, caudle, was a central part of this diet. These foods were intended to rebuild her strength, replenish her blood, and encourage the production of milk. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the shutters is interpreted. Is it a good omen or a bad one? Superstition and faith are woven together so tightly they have become a single, sturdy thread of belief. The development of visual aids in medical texts, like the woodcuts in Röslin's Der Rosengart, was a monumental step forward. For the first time, midwives and surgeons who could not read Latin but could interpret pictures had access to anatomical information. These images, while often stylized and inaccurate by our standards, showed the baby in various positions in the womb and depicted the use of instruments like birthing stools and hooks. The concept of a good death was very important in medieval culture, and this applied to the birthing chamber as well. If it became clear that a mother was dying, the focus would shift from saving her life to ensuring she died in a state of grace. A priest would be called to administer the last rites, confession, communion, and anointing with holy oil. Her family would gather around her to pray and say their goodbyes. The goal was to ensure her soul was prepared for its journey to the afterlife. The simple act of swaddling a baby had a direct impact on the mother's workload. An unswaddled baby requires constant supervision. It can wriggle, roll, and potentially harm itself. A swaddled baby, on the other hand, is a neat, immobile package. It can be safely laid down for extended periods, freeing up the mother's hands to perform other essential tasks. The idea that a woman's milk could transmit her moral character was a powerful and pervasive belief. This is why the selection of a wet nurse for an aristocratic child was such a critical decision. The family would seek a woman who was not only healthy and had a good milk supply, but who was also known to be patient, honest, and pious. Let's consider the placenta from a medical perspective. The failure to deliver it completely was a major cause of both postpartum hemorrhage and infection. If even a small piece of the placenta remained in the uterus, it could prevent the uterus from contracting properly and could become a breeding ground for bacteria. The midwife's ability to recognize an incomplete placenta was a critical skill. She would examine it carefully after delivery, looking to see if it was whole. The first cry of the newborn was more than just a sound of life. It was a sound of personhood. In many medieval cultures, a baby was not considered a full member of the family or community until it had cried out. This first breath and cry signaled its viability and its entry into the world of the living. A baby born silent was in a liminal state, not quite dead but not yet fully alive. The architecture of the home itself played a role in the birthing experience. In a simple peasant cottage, the birthing chamber might just be a corner of the main room, separated by a curtain. The entire family would be in close proximity, hearing every sound. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. In a wealthy merchant's house or a castle, a dedicated room could be set aside. The emotional bond between the mother and her gossips was forged in the fire of the birthing chamber. These were the women who had seen her at her most vulnerable, who had held her, coached her, and prayed with her through the worst pain of her life. This shared experience created a unique and powerful form of female kinship. It was a bond of shared trauma and shared triumph. A woman knew that when her time came, her gossips would be there for her, and she, in turn, would attend their births. The slow, creeping progress of medical science often came at a high cost. Every new technique, every new instrument had to be tested through trial and error, and these errors were often fatal. The early pioneers of obstetrics, men like the chamberlains or the first surgeons to attempt new procedures, were operating on the very edge of knowledge. Their successes were hailed as miracles, but their failures were buried in nameless graves. The religious art of the period gives us a powerful, if idealized, glimpse into the culture of birth. Paintings of the Nativity or the birth of the Virgin Mary often include details from contemporary birthing practices. We see midwives, gossips, swaddling clothes, and basins of water. While the central figures are serene and holy, the background action often depicts a recognizable human scene. These paintings served a dual purpose. They were devotional objects, meant to inspire piety. They believe the womb can wander, that the humors of the body must be in perfect balance. Their understanding of the process is a tapestry of folklore, ancient Greek medicine, and profound religious doctrine, a framework far removed from our own. The psychological concept of dissociation may have been a crucial, if unconscious, survival mechanism for women in labor. Faced with overwhelming and prolonged pain from which there was no escape, some women may have entered a trance-like state, mentally detaching from the physical sensations in their body. The rhythmic chanting of prayers, the dim light, and the monotonous, rocking motions sometimes used could all have contributed to inducing this altered state of consciousness. The very air of the lying-in chamber, intended to be protective, was often the source of danger. By sealing the room against drafts and bad air, the occupants were also sealing themselves in with airborne pathogens. A single person with a cough or a cold could easily infect the entire room. In the close, warm, unventilated space, bacteria would thrive on unwashed linens and in leftover food. The financial incentive for a male physician to enter the field of childbirth was significant. Midwifery was a relatively low-status, female-dominated profession, often paid for in kind. By rebranding childbirth as a medical problem requiring expert, scientific intervention, male physicians could justify charging much higher fees. The invention and control of instruments like the forceps was a key part of this strategy. Consider the emotional world of a child in the Middle Ages. They would have grown up with the direct knowledge that their own birth had been a moment of great peril for their mother. They would have witnessed their mother or other female relatives go through repeated, dangerous pregnancies. They would almost certainly have experienced the death of younger siblings, either at birth or in infancy. This constant proximity to the life and death stakes of reproduction would have shaped their understanding of the world. The practice of bleeding a pregnant or laboring woman, known as phlebotomy, seems shocking to us, but it was a standard medical procedure for centuries. It was based on the humoral theory that sickness was caused by an imbalance, and that removing excess blood could restore health. A woman suffering from what we would now recognize as preeclampsia, with its high blood pressure and swelling, might be bled to reduce her plethora, or excessive humors. The midwife's bag of tools was a simple one, consisting mostly of her own 2 hands and her knowledge of herbs. However, she might have carried a few small items. These could include a bottle of holy water for emergency baptisms, sharp scissors or a knife for cutting the umbilical cord, and linen or silk thread for tying it off. She might also have carried small packets of dried herbs for making teas or fumigations, and perhaps a jar of oil or lard to use as a lubricant. The legal concept of the belly plea is a fascinating intersection of law and childbirth. If a woman was condemned to death, she could plead her belly, meaning she could claim to be pregnant. If she was found to be pregnant, her execution would be delayed until after she had given birth. This was not done out of mercy for the mother, but out of a belief that the innocent fetus should not be punished for the sins of its parent. The social stigma of a cesarean section, even when performed on a dead mother, was considerable. There was a belief that a child born this way was somehow unnatural. They were sometimes called filii Caesari, or Caesar's children, and were viewed with a mixture of awe and suspicion. There was also a folk belief that a woman who died in childbirth and required a post-mortem section must have been a great sinner, her body refusing to give up the child naturally even in death. The role of the bed in the birthing process is significant. In the early medieval period, birth often took place on a low pallet on the floor, allowing the woman to easily move into squatting or kneeling positions. The large, high bed that we associate with the era became more common later. While a symbol of status, giving birth in a high bed could be less practical. It encouraged the less effective position of lying on one's back. However, the bed was also a potent symbol. The development of anesthetics in the mid-19th century was the single most important revolution in the history of childbirth. When Queen Victoria chose to use chloroform for the birth of her 8th child in 1853, it was a watershed moment. Her decision, which she described as blessed, helped to legitimize the use of pain relief in labor and overcome the fierce religious objections that it was a defiance of God's will. There is no understanding of germs, no concept of antiseptic practice. The hands that touch her, the cloths that wipe her brow, carry invisible armies of bacteria, the most lethal threat of all in this sacred, sealed room. The sheer physical intimacy of the medieval birthing room is something we have lost. The laboring woman was in constant physical contact with her attendants. They held her hands, rubbed her back, supported her weight, and cleaned her body. There was no sense of clinical detachment. The midwife's hands were inside her body, feeling the baby's position. The gossips' bodies were pressed against hers, lending her their strength. This was a profoundly embodied and communal experience. The history of infanticide is a dark and difficult part of this story. In a world with no effective contraception, unwanted pregnancies were common. For a desperate, unmarried woman with no means of support, a newborn infant could be a death sentence for them both. While the church and the law condemned infanticide as a mortal sin and a capital crime, it undoubtedly occurred. The change in the position for birth from upright to lying down supine is a story of shifting power dynamics. For centuries, women had given birth in positions that were guided by instinct and gravity, squatting, kneeling, or using a birthing stool. These positions were efficient and physiologically sound. The shift to the supine position became popular in the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in France. The spiritual state of the midwife herself was considered to be of great importance. She was expected to be a pious, God-fearing woman in a state of grace. It was believed that a midwife who was sinful or had not been to confession could bring bad luck or even demonic influence into the birthing chamber. Her prayers were considered more effective if her soul was clean. This belief placed a heavy burden on the midwife. She was not just a medical practitioner, she was a spiritual conduit. The role of amulets and talismans was central to the management of fear. Beyond the religious relics and birth girdles, women would use a variety of magical objects. A piece of coral was thought to ward off the evil eye. A dried toad worn in a bag around the neck was believed to ease labor pains. A key might be placed in the bed to unlock the womb. These objects, drawn from a deep well of European folklore, provided a sense of agency. The lack of any understanding of genetics meant that hereditary conditions were a complete mystery. If a certain problem, like a contracted pelvis or a tendency to hemorrhage, ran in a family, it would be seen not as a genetic inheritance but as a family curse or a sign of divine disfavor. A woman whose mother or sister had died in childbirth would enter her own labor with a sense of dread and fatalism. She would feel that she was doomed to repeat the tragedy. The seasonal cycle had a significant impact on birth outcomes. A baby born in the spring or summer had a better chance of survival. The weather was warmer, reducing the risk of death from cold. The mother was likely to be better nourished from the recent harvest, leading to a healthier baby and a better milk supply. Fresh food was more available. Conversely, a baby born in the depths of winter faced much greater challenges. The mother might be malnourished after a long, lean season. The legal rights of a newborn infant were minimal until it was baptized. Baptism was the ceremony that transformed the baby from a mere biological entity into a person with a soul and a place in the Christian community. An unbaptized infant had no legal standing. This is why the midwife's power to perform an emergency baptism was so critical. If a baby died before a priest could arrive, the midwife's action ensured its salvation and its identity as a Christian soul. The development of the printing press in the 15th century eventually led to the spread of secret remedies and folk wisdom beyond oral tradition. Small, cheap books and pamphlets known as chapbooks became popular. These often contained sections on health, including remedies for problems in pregnancy and childbirth. They were a mixture of practical advice, herbal recipes, and pure superstition. The psychological state of giving up was a recognized and feared phenomenon. A woman who had been in agonizing labor for days could reach a point of complete physical and emotional exhaustion. She might lose the will to live, turning her face to the wall and refusing to push or even speak. The midwife and gossips would see this as a catastrophic sign. They would redouble their efforts to encourage her, to plead with her, to pray over her, and to try and rally her spirits. The fear is palpable, a metallic taste in the mouth. 1 in 3 women might not survive the ordeal or its immediate aftermath. Every woman who entered the birthing chamber knew she might never leave it alive. The aftermath of a traumatic birth that resulted in a living child and mother was still fraught with difficulty. The mother might be left with permanent physical injuries, such as a fistula, a tear between the vagina and the bladder or rectum, which resulted in constant, humiliating incontinence. Such an injury would make a woman a social outcast. The sheer power of community expectations cannot be understated. A medieval woman did not labor in a vacuum. She labored as a representative of her family and her lineage. Her performance was a matter of public record. Did she endure her suffering with pious fortitude, or did she scream and curse? Her behavior would be reported and discussed by the gossips throughout the community. The midwife's hands were not just tools, they were her diagnostic instruments. Through touch alone, she had to assess the dilation of the cervix, the position of the baby's head, and the strength of the uterine contractions. This was a highly developed skill, a tactile literacy that was learned over years of apprenticeship and practice. She could distinguish a foot from a hand, a shoulder from a buttock, all within the dark, cramped confines of the birth canal. The concept of risk was perceived very differently. We live in a world that seeks to quantify and mitigate risk through statistics, insurance, and preventative medicine. In the medieval world, risk was understood through the lens of fate, divine will, and luck. Childbirth was inherently a gamble, a peril to be faced. A woman would prepare for it by making her peace with God, not by developing a detailed birth plan. This fatalistic worldview could be a source of both comfort and helplessness. The financial ruin that could follow a maternal death was a catastrophe for the surviving family. A peasant farmer would lose his partner in labor, the person who ran the household, cared for the children, and contributed to the family's economic survival. He would have to quickly find a new wife or risk the collapse of his farm and family. For a craftsman, the loss of his wife could be equally devastating. The role of music and chanting in the birthing chamber is an often overlooked aspect. The singing of hymns, the chanting of litanies to the saints, and the recitation of psalms were common practices. This served several purposes. The rhythmic, repetitive nature of the sound could be calming and hypnotic for the laboring woman, helping her to manage her pain and anxiety. It created a sense of solidarity and shared purpose among the attendants. The legacy of the wandering womb theory persisted for centuries, well beyond the Middle Ages. This ancient Greek idea, which held that the uterus could become dislodged and travel around the body causing all manner of ailments, was a cornerstone of how female health was misunderstood. It was used to explain everything from shortness of breath to fainting spells and emotional outbursts, which were often labeled hysteria, from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb. The swaddling clothes themselves were often imbued with significance. A family might use a set of swaddling bands that had been passed down through generations, carrying with them the luck and history of the family. For a wealthy family, these bands could be made of fine linen or even silk, embroidered with protective symbols or the family's coat of arms. They were an important part of a baby's layette, prepared with great care by the mother and her female relatives during the pregnancy. The contrast between the public joy of a royal birth and the private suffering of the queen is a poignant one. When a healthy heir was born, the news would be met with public celebrations. Bells would ring, bonfires would be lit, and wine would flow in the streets. The kingdom would rejoice in the security of the succession. But behind the closed doors of the lying-in chamber, the queen would be recovering from a brutal physical ordeal, exhausted, in pain, and facing the high risk of postpartum infection. The fear of a changeling was a very real part of the folklore surrounding birth. It was believed that fairies or other supernatural beings would sometimes steal a healthy human infant from its cradle and leave a sickly, non-human replacement in its place. A baby that was fretful, had a disability, or failed to thrive might be suspected of being a changeling. This superstition provided an explanation for infant illnesses and disabilities that were otherwise inexplicable. Her will is a powerful force. She is encouraged to walk, to squat, to lean on her companions, using gravity as her ally. Her body's instincts are her surest guide in a world with few other reliable maps to follow. The simple act of washing hands, the cornerstone of modern hygiene, was completely alien to the medieval medical mindset. A surgeon might go from lancing a boil, to setting a broken bone, to attending a difficult birth without any concept of cross-contamination. The visible dirt might be wiped off, but the invisible world of microbes was unknown. The emotional recovery from a stillbirth or the death of an infant was a private and often lonely journey. While the grief was immense, society expected a woman, especially a noblewoman, to recover quickly and become pregnant again. Her primary duty was to produce children, and she was expected to fulfill it. There was little room for prolonged public mourning. The grief was often internalized, carried as a quiet sorrow. The midwife's social standing was a paradox. On one hand, she was an essential and respected figure, privy to the most intimate secrets of every family in the community. On the other hand, her work was with the unclean processes of birth, and she was often associated with the world of women, which was seen as subordinate to the world of men. She was not a member of the educated elite. Her knowledge was practical, not theoretical. The use of enemas was a common intervention during a difficult labor. Based on the humoral theory, it was believed that clearing the bowels would create more room in the pelvis for the baby to descend. It was also thought to stimulate uterine contractions. The midwife would administer the enema using a clister pipe, a long syringe-like device. While this practice may have had some minor benefits, it also carried risks. The first few hours after birth are a critical period for bonding between mother and child. In the medieval period, this process was often interrupted. The baby would be quickly taken from the mother to be washed, examined, and swaddled by the attendants. If the mother was wealthy, the baby might be handed over to a wet nurse almost immediately. While these practices were done for reasons of health and social custom, they could interfere with the crucial, instinctual process of mother-infant bonding. The legal doctrine of coverture had a profound impact on a woman's life and her experience of motherhood. Under English common law, for example, when a woman married, her legal identity was subsumed by that of her husband. She could not own property, sign contracts, or sue in court. Her children legally belonged to her husband. This lack of legal autonomy meant that she had very little control over her own reproductive life. The decision to have more children was not hers to make. The fear of divine judgment was a constant presence in the birthing chamber. A stillbirth, a disabled child, or a particularly agonizing labor were often interpreted as a punishment for a specific sin committed by the mother or father. This could be a past infidelity, a moment of blasphemy, or a failure to observe religious duties. This belief system created a toxic environment of guilt and blame. The sheer physical strength required of a midwife should not be underestimated. She had to be able to support the weight of a laboring woman for hours on end. She had to have the strength in her hands and arms to perform a manual version, turning a baby in the womb against the force of contractions. She had to be able to endure long, sleepless nights, remaining calm and authoritative in the face of chaos and panic. Her work was not just mentally and emotionally draining, it was physically grueling. The umbilical cord was a source of great fascination and superstition. The way it was tied and cut was thought to influence the child's future. For example, the length of the stump left on the baby was sometimes believed to determine the size of the child's future genitals. The dried cord stump, once it fell off, was often saved. It might be kept as a good luck charm for the child, or it might be ground into a powder and used in folk remedies. The role of saint shrines in dealing with infertility and dangerous pregnancies was hugely important. A woman who was struggling to conceive or who feared a difficult birth might make a long and arduous pilgrimage to the shrine of a saint known for helping with such matters, like Saint Margaret or the Virgin Mary. At the shrine, she would pray, leave an offering, and perhaps touch a sacred relic. These pilgrimages were major undertakings, but they offered a profound sense of hope. The midwife might offer a potion, its contents a secret guarded with her life. It could be a simple herbal tea to strengthen contractions, or something far stranger, born of desperation and ancient, sometimes dangerous, lore. The concept of a gestational period was not precisely fixed. While it was generally understood to be around 9 months, the exact timing was a matter of estimation. Without modern dating techniques, the due date was calculated based on the woman's last menstruation, which could be an unreliable measure. This meant that a baby born a few weeks early or late could be a source of anxiety. The development of the obstetric forceps by the Chamberlain family is a story of both genius and greed. The instrument was a brilliant solution to one of the most common and deadly problems in childbirth, an obstructed labor where the baby's head was stuck in the pelvis. The forceps allowed the practitioner to get a firm but gentle grip on the head and guide it out, saving both mother and child. Let's reconsider the environment of the lying-in chamber from a psychological perspective. The woman was confined to a dark, quiet room for a month or more. She was separated from the normal routines of her life and the wider community. While intended to be a period of rest, this prolonged sensory deprivation and social isolation could have profound psychological effects. It could lead to a state of disorientation, anxiety, and deep depression. The fear of hemorrhage was a constant and terrifying presence. A woman could bleed to death with shocking speed. The midwife's main tools against this were uterine massage and the use of astringent herbs, but these were often ineffective against a major bleed. They had no concept of blood pressure, IV fluids, or surgical interventions to stop the bleeding. All they could do was watch in horror as the life drained out of the new mother. The economic impact of a midwife's work was significant. A skilled and respected midwife could make a comfortable living, not usually in cash, but in goods, services, and social capital. Her payment, a chicken, a sack of flour, a promise of help with the harvest, was a vital part of the local gift economy. Her success was a direct benefit to the community. Conversely, an unsuccessful birth could have economic repercussions for her. The legacy of fear surrounding childbirth persisted for centuries. Even as medical science advanced, the deep cultural memory of birth as a dangerous and agonizing ordeal remained. The stories of grandmothers and great-grandmothers who had died in childbirth, or who had suffered terribly, were passed down through generations of women. This created a powerful undercurrent of anxiety that accompanied pregnancy, even in an era of improving safety. The role of the church in providing a form of social safety net, however limited, is worth noting. Many monasteries and convents offered a degree of charitable care to the poor, which could include assistance for pregnant women and new mothers. The parish priest was often a source of support and guidance. The church's condemnation of infanticide and its emphasis on the sanctity of infant life, at least after baptism, provided a moral framework that encouraged the care of children. The shift from midwife to male accoucheur was also a shift in philosophy. The traditional midwife generally saw birth as a natural process that should be interfered with as little as possible. Her approach was one of patience, support, and watchful waiting. The new male-dominated field of obstetrics, on the other hand, increasingly viewed birth as a mechanical problem to be actively managed and controlled. The story of Jane Seymour, the third wife of King Henry VIII, is a tragic and famous example of the perils of royal childbirth. In 1537, she finally gave Henry what he so desperately wanted, a healthy male heir, the future King Edward VI. The birth was long and difficult, reportedly lasting for 2 days and 3 nights. While the baby survived and thrived, Jane's ordeal was just beginning. A few days after the birth, she developed a high fever and fell gravely ill. The very concept of privacy As we understand, it did not exist in the same way. The medieval world was a far more communal and less individualistic society. A person's life was intertwined with their family, their neighbors, and their parish. The birthing chamber, while an exclusively female space, was not a private one. It was a communal space where the most intimate act of a woman's life was witnessed, judged, and supported by her community. Imagine a world lit only by fire and faith. A world where life is a fragile, flickering candle, and the shadows hold both comfort and dread. This was the world into which every child was born, and every mother descended into her trial. The future of a family, of a bloodline, of a kingdom, rests upon the events unfolding in this room. The birth of a healthy heir is a cause for ringing bells, a stillbirth, a cause for silent, devastating grief. The final moments of a successful birth were a powerful release of tension. The baby's first cry, cutting through the exhausted silence, was a signal of victory. The midwife would announce the sex of the child, a moment of great anticipation, especially for a noble family awaiting an heir. The gossips would erupt in joyful congratulations. The mother, exhausted but flooded with relief, would finally be able to rest. So, why was medieval childbirth so horrifying? As we have seen, it was not one single reason, but a perfect storm of devastating factors. It was a world that viewed excruciating pain not as a medical symptom to be treated, but as a spiritual penance to be endured, a punishment for the original sin of Eve. This theological framework actively discouraged the search for pain relief and sanctified suffering, placing the fate of the soul far above the comfort of the body. The horror was also rooted in a complete ignorance of the microbial world. The lack of germ theory meant there was no understanding of sanitation, of hand washing, of sterile instruments. The most loving and attentive care from a midwife or a physician could introduce the invisible bacteria that would cause the deadly childbed fever, the single greatest killer of new mothers. The very air, water, and hands that were meant to bring comfort were often the sources of a silent, unstoppable death. Furthermore, the experience was amplified by the immense social and psychological pressure placed upon women. A woman's entire worth was often tied to her ability to produce children, specifically male heirs. She labored on a public stage, her performance judged by her community. Her success or failure had profound consequences for her family's status, wealth, and future. This constant scrutiny, this weight of expectation, added an immense mental burden to the already crushing physical one. And when things went wrong, the available solutions were instruments of terror. We must never forget the sharp hook of the surgeon, the brutal reality of embryotomy, and the choice between a mother's life and her child's. We must remember the cesarean section as an act of post-mortem baptism, not a life-saving surgery. These weren't sadistic acts. They were the absolute limits of what was possible in a world that had no other options. The path away from this horror was agonizingly slow and fraught with resistance. It required revolutionary thinkers like Vesalius to challenge the dogmatic authority of ancient texts and map the body correctly. It needed the quiet, stubborn observation of men like Ignaz Semmelweis to prove that invisible particles on the hands of doctors were killing their patients, a truth so simple and so profound that the medical establishment of his day rejected it with contempt. The invention of the forceps by the Chamberlain family represents a crucial, if morally complicated, milestone. It was the first glimmer of a new possibility, that an instrument could be used not to destroy a baby, but to save it. While their secrecy delayed progress for a century, the eventual dissemination of the forceps marked the dawn of instrumental delivery. We must also acknowledge the wisdom that was lost. The traditional, female-led model of birth, with its emphasis on upright positions, on continuous emotional support from trusted companions, and on patience, contained a deep, embodied knowledge. The upright positions, for example, were physiologically superior, using gravity to aid labor. The constant support of the gossips was a powerful tool against fear and exhaustion. The story of medieval childbirth is, in the end, a story of profound female resilience. It is a testament to the unrecorded courage of millions of women who walked into the chamber of ordeal knowing they might not walk out. They faced their trial armed with faith, community, and an inner strength we can only marvel at. They were not merely passive victims of their time. They were the essential actors in the great drama of human survival. Reflecting on this history evokes a powerful sense of gratitude. The safety that surrounds modern childbirth in many parts of the world is a luxury built upon a mountain of past suffering. The clean hospital room, the electronic fetal monitor, the availability of antibiotics, blood transfusions, and safe anesthesia. These are the fruits of centuries of slow, painful progress. They are the answers to the desperate prayers whispered in countless medieval birthing chambers. They pray for a quick delivery, for a perfect child. But they also pray for a quick death if the agony becomes too great, a merciful end to a suffering that seems to have no end. Both outcomes are in God's hands. This history also serves as a crucial reminder of the importance of listening to women's voices. For centuries, the field of obstetrics was dominated by men who theorized about a process they never experienced. The knowledge of midwives, based on generations of direct, hands-on experience, was dismissed as unscientific folklore. The medieval midwife stands as a figure of immense historical importance. She was the keeper of a sacred, practical knowledge, passed from woman to woman. She was a counselor, a spiritual guide, and a pillar of her community. Though she worked without the benefit of science, she acted with courage and compassion in the face of overwhelming challenges. The eventual decline of the midwife's autonomy and the rise of the male physician was a complex event that brought both progress and loss. The fear of the monstrous birth reveals the deep anxieties of the age. In a world that sought order and meaning in divine providence, a child born with a severe disability was a terrifying disruption. It challenged their understanding of the natural world and of God's plan. The elaborate theories of maternal impression, of demonic influence, of parental sin, were all attempts to explain the inexplicable, to impose a narrative of cause and effect onto a random biological event. The story of childbed fever is a particularly tragic chapter. The solution, simple hand washing, was so close, yet so far. It required a complete paradigm shift, an acceptance of a world teeming with invisible life. The resistance to Semmelweis's discovery was not just about scientific disagreement. It was about professional pride and social status. The idea that a gentleman physician could be a carrier of filth was a deep personal and professional insult. The deep connection between childbirth and sin, a legacy of the interpretation of the book of Genesis, had arguably the most profound and lasting negative impact. It created a culture where female pain was seen as normal, necessary, and even righteous. This not only hindered the development of pain relief, but also contributed to a broader culture of misogyny, where the female body was seen as inherently flawed, a source of temptation and suffering. The social world of the gossips is a beautiful and complex part of this story. They represent the power of female community, a network of mutual support that was a woman's primary resource in times of crisis. They brought food, they offered prayers, they held hands, and they shared the burden of fear. This informal, female-centered system of care stood in contrast to the formal, male-dominated institutions of the church and academic medicine. The medieval birthing stool is a potent symbol of a lost, woman-centered wisdom. Its design was perfectly suited to the physiology of birth, using gravity and body mechanics to ease the process. Its disappearance in favor of the supine position represents a moment where the convenience of the usually male practitioner took precedence over the well-being of the laboring woman. The sheer number of pregnancies a woman might endure is a fact worth pausing on. In a world without reliable contraception, a woman could spend the vast majority of her adult life either pregnant or breastfeeding. A life punctuated by a dozen or more cycles of pregnancy and birth was not unusual. Each one of these was a life-threatening ordeal. The cumulative risk was staggering. A woman was not just facing a single trial, she was facing a series of them, year after year. The spiritual rituals surrounding birth were not mere superstitions. They were essential technologies of hope. The birth girdles, the sacred relics, the prayers to Saint Margaret. These were the tools that people used to manage overwhelming anxiety in a world of profound uncertainty. They provided a sense of agency, a way to actively engage with the mysterious forces that governed life and death. To dismiss these practices as simple ignorance is to miss their vital psychological and social function. The stark reality of the surgeon's hook, the crotchet, must remain a central image in our understanding. It represents the absolute brutal bottom line of medieval obstetrics. When all else failed, the only recourse was destructive. This fact alone tells us almost everything we need to know. It speaks to the desperation, the limited knowledge, and the horrifying choices that practitioners and families were forced to make. The first cry of a newborn is a sound that cuts through the tension like a divine trumpet. It is the sound of victory, of relief, of a prayer answered. It is the sound of life continuing against formidable odds. The story of birth is a story of class. The peasant woman laboring on a straw pallet in a one-room hut and the queen laboring in a grand, tapestried chamber faced the same fundamental biological dangers of hemorrhage and infection. Yet their experiences were shaped in profoundly different ways by their social standing. The queen had better food and more attendants, but she also labored under the crushing weight of dynastic expectation. The legacy of this period is also one of profound silence. The vast majority of women who underwent this ordeal were illiterate. They did not leave behind diaries, letters, or memoirs describing their experiences. Their stories have been lost to us. We reconstruct their world from mail-authored medical texts, from church records, from archaeological evidence, and from the rare writings of a few elite women. The emotional landscape of medieval motherhood was a complex terrain of joy, fear, love, and grief. The love for a child was no less profound than it is today, but it existed alongside the constant, grim awareness of mortality. A mother had to have the strength to love deeply, knowing that the object of her love could be snatched away at any moment. This created a kind of emotional resilience that is difficult for us to comprehend. The deep-seated suspicion of female knowledge is a recurring theme. The midwife's wisdom, because it was practical, traditional, and passed down outside of formal institutions, was easily dismissed as old wives' tales, or more ominously as witchcraft. The professionalization of medicine was, in part, a process of discrediting this female tradition and replacing it with a male, text-based authority. This was a struggle over who had the right to knowledge and who had the right to heal. In conclusion, the medieval birthing chamber was a place of profound paradox. It was a sanctuary that could become a death trap. It was a space of intense female solidarity that was also a stage for public judgment. It was governed by a faith that offered immense comfort while simultaneously sanctifying suffering. It was a place of creation, shadowed constantly by the presence of death. As we leave this history behind and return to our own time, let us carry with us a renewed appreciation for the quiet heroism of these forgotten women. Theirs is not a story of kings or of battles, but it is a story that is fundamental to our own existence. Every one of us is here because of a long, unbroken chain of mothers who faced this ordeal and survived. Their courage is our inheritance. But silence is the most dreaded sound of all. A silence that means the journey has ended in tragedy, that the battle has been lost. It is a heavy, suffocating blanket that falls upon the room. the ordeal is not over with the birth. The delivery of the afterbirth is a second, perilous trial. A retained placenta is a death sentence, and the methods to retrieve it are born of sheer, brutal desperation. For days and weeks after, the mother will lie in, confined to her bed. She is considered open, vulnerable not just to sickness but to evil influences. The chamber remains her sanctuary and her prison. This period of lying in is when the invisible killer, childbed fever, most often strikes. A woman could survive the birth itself only to be claimed by a raging infection days later, a cruel and common fate. This experience forged a unique bond between women. They were united by this shared trial, a sisterhood of survivors who understood a reality that was entirely inaccessible and unknown to the world of men. The memory of the pain, the fear, the loss, was etched into the collective consciousness of medieval women. It shaped their art, their prayers, and their understanding of their place in the divine and earthly order. A relic of a saint, a splinter of the cross, a thread from the Virgin Mary's cloak, these were the most advanced medical technologies available to them. Faith was their primary medicine, their ultimate source of hope. The air in the chamber is thick with the scent of boiled herbs, beeswax, and human sweat. The windows are shuttered, not just against the cold, but against the malevolent spirits believed to ride on the wind, seeking to harm the vulnerable. The story of medieval childbirth is not one of ignorance, but of a different kind of knowledge. It is a story of profound faith, communal strength, and the raw, unyielding courage of women facing their mortality. Consider the weight of a single sentence. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. This biblical verse from Genesis was not just scripture, it was a diagnosis, a prognosis, and a divine judgment all in one. For the medieval woman, labor was not merely a biological process. It was her personal reenactment of Eve's original sin. The pain was not a symptom to be eliminated, but a penance to be endured, a path to spiritual purification. The birthing chamber became a spiritual battleground. Demons were thought to gather, eager to snatch the soul of the unbaptized infant or the exhausted, vulnerable mother. Hence the shuttered windows and the lit candles, pushing back a very real darkness. We must understand that to seek relief from the pain was, in the eyes of some theologians, to defy God's will. It was an act of pride, an attempt to sidestep the righteous punishment laid upon all daughters of Eve. This theological framework had a direct, terrifying consequence. It dramatically slowed any real medical inquiry into pain relief. Why seek a cure for something that was considered a sacred, necessary suffering? The focus was on the soul, not the body. The ideal birth was one where the woman suffered piously, accepting her fate with prayerful resignation. Her cries were not just of agony, but were prayers themselves, a direct appeal to God from the depths of her travail. She was surrounded by the invisible company of saints. Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of childbirth, was a constant presence. Legend told she had been swallowed by a dragon and emerged unharmed, a powerful metaphor for emerging from the belly of labor. Birth girdles, long scrolls made of silk, paper, or parchment, were a crucial tool. Inscribed with prayers, holy names, and images of the saints, they were loaned out by churches and monasteries, their sacred power thought to ease delivery and protect the wearer. Yet even these sacred objects could be a source of dread. If a woman died while wearing a blessed girdle, it could bring shame upon the object and its owner. Her failure to deliver was a spiritual failure, a sign of her unworthiness. Here, in this sealed space, time itself seems to warp. The rhythms are not of the sun and moon, but of the body, of the relentless, agonizing pulse of labor that pulls a woman to the very brink of existence. The most urgent ritual was baptism. If an infant was in distress or seemed likely to die, the midwife was empowered to perform an emergency baptism. The baby's eternal salvation was infinitely more important than its fleeting earthly life. This focus on the soul over the body explains so much of the horror. It is the key that unlocks the medieval mindset, a mindset that could accept immense physical suffering as a necessary part of a much larger cosmic drama. Imagine the psychological burden. Not only are you in excruciating physical pain, but you are also taught that this pain is your fault, a consequence of an ancestral sin. Your struggle is a public testament to your piety or your sinfulness. The entire event was framed by the church's calendar. A child conceived in sin, outside of wedlock, was believed to be more likely to cause a difficult birth, adding another layer of shame and fear to the ordeal for many women. After the birth, the mother was considered ritually impure, stained by the blood of her labor. She could not re-enter society until she had undergone the churching ceremony, a ritual of purification and thanksgiving, usually 40 days later. This impurity wasn't seen as hygienic but spiritual. It echoed ancient purity laws, reinforcing the idea that childbirth, while necessary, was an event tied to the fallen, fleshly nature of humanity, a departure from the sacred. So the horror begins here, before any medical instrument is used, before any complication arises. It begins with an idea, the idea that a woman's body is a site of divine punishment and her agony a form of prayer. This belief system, while providing comfort and meaning to some, created a powerful barrier to progress. It sanctified suffering, making the quest to alleviate it a near blasphemous act in the eyes of the establishment. The sounds from the birthing chamber were not just those of a woman in labor. They were the sounds of a soul in purgatory, fighting for its own redemption and for the life of the child she carried. The story of medieval childbirth is inextricably linked with the story of Eve. To understand the woman in the birthing bed, we must first understand her connection to the woman in the Garden of Eden. The sorrow was her inheritance. This room is a woman's world. No man is permitted to cross its threshold, save for a priest in the most desperate of hours. It is a sanctuary of female strength, shared knowledge, and whispered prayers against a common mortal fear. And so, with the weight of heaven and hell pressing down upon her, the medieval woman began her labor. Her body was a crucible, and the fire she endured was believed to be a holy one, for better or for worse. Let us now confront one of the most shocking realities of this entire experience. When all prayers and potions failed, when the labor stalled and the life of the mother hung by a thread, a man might finally be called. He was not a physician in our sense of the word. He was a surgeon, or more accurately, a barber surgeon. His presence was a terrifying admission of defeat. It meant the midwife, with her years of experience, had exhausted all hope. To truly grasp the terror of the medieval birthing room, we must first dismantle our modern understanding of medicine. We live in a world shaped by the germ theory, by antibiotics, by an intricate knowledge of human anatomy. The medieval world had none of these. Their medical framework was built upon the ancient Greek theory of the four humors, proposed by Hippocrates and expanded by Galen. The birthing chamber was an exclusively female space. For a man to enter was a profound breach of social and moral protocol. This created a paradox. On one hand, it fostered a powerful environment of female solidarity. The room was filled with gossips, a term that originally meant god-sibling, referring to the godparents of a child, but came to mean the close female friends and relatives who attended the birth. The midwife was the central figure in this drama. She was a woman of immense importance and deep ambiguity in the community. A successful midwife was revered, seen as possessing a divine gift in her hands. She was a pillar of the female community, a keeper of secrets, and a source of great comfort. Her knowledge was empirical, passed down through generations of oral tradition. She knew which herbs might strengthen contractions and which could ease pain. The spiritual dimension of childbirth cannot be overstated. The entire event was perceived as a battle against the forces of darkness. This is why the room was sealed. Windows and even keyholes were blocked to prevent demons from entering. Lit candles, symbols of Christ, the light of the world, were kept burning. The pains of labor were seen as the physical manifestation of Eve's curse. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. This belief had a profound impact on the woman's experience. Let's examine the science behind their understanding of the body. Medieval anatomical knowledge was severely limited and deeply flawed, particularly concerning women. Human dissection was rare and often forbidden by the Church. Therefore, physicians relied on the texts of ancient writers like Galen, whose understanding of human anatomy was based on the dissection of animals, primarily pigs and Barbary apes. When a labor became obstructed, the midwife and her assistants would resort to a variety of desperate measures. These interventions reveal a world devoid of our understanding of biomechanics and physiology. The laboring woman might be violently shaken, rolled in a blanket, or even dropped from a height, with the hope that the jarring motion would dislodge the baby. The role of the Church was deeply woven into every aspect of the ordeal. Before labor began, a woman was expected to confess her sins to a priest, to enter her travail in a state of grace. This was her preparation for what was widely seen as a potential death. During the birth, religious relics were often employed as medical instruments. A girdle said to have been worn by a saint might be wrapped around the woman's abdomen. A sacred text might be laid upon her body. Let us return to the barber surgeon and his terrifying tools. These instruments were not stored in sterile packaging. They were likely kept in a leather roll, wiped clean but teeming with invisible bacteria. The most common tool was the sharp hook, or crotchet. This was a long metal rod with a viciously sharp hook at the end. It was used to pierce the fetus's skull or body, allowing the surgeon to gain purchase and pull the remains out of the birth canal. On the wall hangs a crucifix, its wooden figure a silent testament to suffering and salvation. Every contraction, every cry is seen through the lens of faith, a penance, a test, a sacred agony ordained since the dawn of time. What about a cesarean section? This procedure existed in the Middle Ages, but it was almost nothing like the modern, life-saving operation we know today. The medieval cesarean section was almost exclusively a post-mortem procedure. It was performed on a mother who had just died in childbirth, with the sole purpose of extracting the baby quickly enough to baptize it before it too expired. The aftermath of the birth, assuming both mother and child survived, was a period of immense danger. The weeks following delivery were known as the lying in. The mother would be confined to her bed or room, often for a month or more. This was partly for her recovery, but also because she was considered ritually impure and physically vulnerable to illness and evil spirits. The sheer statistics of mortality paint a grim picture. While precise numbers are impossible to calculate for the entire period, historians estimate that maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high. Some studies of aristocratic families, for whom records are more complete, suggest that as many as 1 in 3 women could expect to die from a pregnancy-related cause at some point in their lives. Childbirth was, quite simply, the most dangerous thing a woman would ever do. Diet and nutrition played a critical role in the horrifying nature of medieval childbirth. For the vast majority of the population, who were poor peasants, chronic malnutrition was a fact of life. A diet lacking in essential vitamins and minerals, particularly calcium and vitamin D, led to widespread bone deformities. One of the most devastating of these was rickets, which could cause a deformed or narrowed pelvis. The social pressure on a woman in labor was immense, particularly for the nobility. The primary duty of a noblewoman was to produce a male heir to secure the family's lineage, titles, and lands. Her entire value was often tied to her reproductive success. The birthing chamber of a queen or a duchess was not just a medical space, it was a political one. Let's explore the herbal remedies used by midwives in more detail. This was a double-edged sword. On one hand, centuries of trial and error had identified some genuinely useful plants. Raspberry leaf tea, for example, was widely used and is still recommended by some today to tone the uterine muscles. Other herbs had antiseptic or pain-relieving properties. However, this knowledge was imprecise. The line between a helpful dose and a harmful one was dangerously thin. The concept of prenatal care was virtually non-existent. A woman's pregnancy was largely a private affair, managed through folk wisdom and prayer until the moment labor began. There were no checkups, no way of knowing the baby's position, and no way of identifying potential problems like preeclampsia or gestational diabetes. A woman carrying twins would have no idea until she delivered the first baby. The psychological toll of this experience is difficult for us to fully comprehend. Women entered the birthing chamber knowing there was a significant chance they would die. They endured unimaginable pain without effective relief, often for days. They faced the very real possibility of losing their child, and if they survived, they were likely to go through the same ordeal again and again. This repeated trauma, this annual dance with death, must have left deep psychological scars. Postpartum hemorrhage, the rapid loss of blood after delivery, was another major killer, and one they had almost no effective way to combat. It was often caused by a retained placenta or uterine atony, where the uterus fails to contract down after birth. The midwife's main tools were uterine massage and herbal remedies like ergot to try and force a contraction. If these failed, they were helpless. They had no understanding of blood types or transfusion, no IV fluids to combat shock. We must also consider the environment. For a peasant woman, childbirth would likely take place in a small, dark, 1- or 2-room cottage, shared with the rest of her family and possibly even animals. The floor would be dirt or covered with rushes, which were rarely changed and were infested with pests and bacteria. Water would have to be hauled from a river or well, and it was often contaminated. There was no concept of sterile surfaces or clean environments. The bed is not a place of rest, but an altar of sacrifice. The linens, carefully saved, will soon be soaked in the fluids of life and all too often of death. They are a canvas for a story of immense courage. The midwife's role extended beyond the physical act of delivery. She was also a legal and social authority. In cases of suspected infanticide or questions of a child's legitimacy, the midwife was the primary witness. She was often required to take an oath before a bishop or magistrate, swearing she would not substitute another's baby for a stillborn one, a major concern for aristocratic families. The transition from midwife-led birth to male-dominated obstetrics was a long and fraught process that began in this period. As university-trained physicians sought to professionalize medicine, they began to encroach on this traditionally female domain. They often did so by denigrating the midwife's knowledge as unscientific old wives' tales. Yet, for centuries, these male physicians offered little in the way of better outcomes. In fact, in the early years, mortality rates often increased under their care. Let's consider the story of the Chamberlain family, a tale that perfectly encapsulates the secrecy and slow pace of progress. In the late 16th or early 17th century, the Chamberlain family, a dynasty of Huguenot surgeons in England, developed a revolutionary tool, the obstetric forceps. This instrument, composed of 2 separate curved blades, could be inserted into the birth canal, locked together around the baby's head, and used to gently guide it out during a difficult labor. The emotional support system, the gossips, was a critical component of the birthing experience, but it too had a darker side. While these women provided comfort and encouragement, they were also the enforcers of social norms. They were there to witness the birth, and their reports would shape the community's perception of the event. A woman who screamed too much or who was perceived as lacking courage could be shamed. It is crucial to dispel the myth that people in the Middle Ages were ignorant or stupid. Their worldview was not less intelligent than ours. It was simply different, built on a foundation of faith rather than empirical science. They were astute observers of the natural world, but they interpreted their observations through a theological and philosophical lens. A comet was not a ball of ice and rock. It was a divine omen. A plague was not caused by bacteria. It was the wrath of God. In summary, the horror of medieval childbirth was a complex tapestry woven from many threads. There was the theological thread, which defined pain as a righteous penance. There was the medical thread, a flawed understanding of the body that led to dangerous interventions. There was the social thread, the immense pressure to produce heirs and the public nature of the ordeal. And there was the biological thread, the ever-present threat of infection, hemorrhage, and exhaustion in a world without modern medicine. The birthing stool represents a fascinating piece of lost wisdom. Unlike the modern image of a woman lying on her back in bed, a position that became common much later, partly for the convenience of male physicians, many medieval women gave birth in an upright position. They might kneel, stand, or very commonly, use a birthing stool. This was a low, sturdy, C-shaped chair that allowed the woman to sit with her legs apart while being supported by the back of the chair and her attendants. What if a baby was born seemingly dead? This was a moment of profound spiritual crisis. The midwife would employ a range of resuscitation techniques, born of folklore and observation. She might slap the baby, blow smoke into its face, or plunge it into alternating baths of hot and cold water to shock it into breathing. These methods seem brutal to us, but they were desperate attempts to ignite the spark of life. The ultimate goal, however, remained baptism. The economic aspect of childbirth cannot be ignored. For a peasant family, a new mouth to feed could be a significant financial burden, but a new pair of hands was also a future asset. The midwife's services had to be paid for, usually not with money but with goods: a chicken, a loaf of bread, a bolt of cloth. For the wealthy, the costs were far greater. Let us explore the concept of the lying-in period more deeply. This month-long confinement, typically 40 days, was a near-universal practice across Europe. It was a period of transition, where the new mother was considered to be in a liminal state, halfway between the dangerous world of birth and the normal world of society. The room was kept dark and warm, intended to replicate the environment of the womb to help her body close and recover. The midwife moves with a quiet authority. Her hands, wrinkled and knowing, have guided countless souls into the world. They are her only true instruments, repositories of a knowledge passed down not in books, but from mother to daughter. The fear of giving birth to a disabled or monstrous child was a pervasive terror. In a world that sought divine meaning in everything, a child born with a physical deformity was not seen as a medical anomaly, but as a divine portent, a sign of God's anger, or the result of parental sin. It could also be blamed on witchcraft or a maternal impression, the belief that a shocking or frightening experience endured by the mother during pregnancy could physically manifest on the child. The legal status of women was intrinsically tied to their reproductive capacity. Under medieval law, a woman was largely under the authority of her father, and then her husband. Her ability to inherit or control property was often limited. However, as a mother, particularly the mother of a male heir, she gained significant informal power and status within the family and the community. The umbilical cord and the placenta were treated with a mixture of medical concern and ritualistic superstition. The midwife knew that the delivery of the placenta, the afterbirth, was a crucial and dangerous stage. A retained placenta could lead to hemorrhage and death. She would use massage, herbal remedies, and sometimes gentle traction on the cord to encourage its delivery. Once delivered, the placenta was often read for omens about the child's future. Breastfeeding was the norm and essential for infant survival. In a world without safe alternatives, mother's milk was the only suitable food for a newborn. However, it was not always the mother who did the breastfeeding, especially among the upper classes. The use of a wet nurse was common practice for noble and wealthy merchant families. This was done for several reasons. The role of sound and silence in the birthing chamber was profoundly significant. The cries of the laboring woman, the encouraging words of the gossips, the muttered prayers of the midwife, these were the soundtrack of life entering the world. The church bells might be rung to frighten away demons during a particularly difficult labor, but silence was the sound of terror. The silence of a stalled labor, when contractions cease and exhaustion sets in, was a sign of impending doom. We must remember that for the medieval woman, there was no separation between mind and body. The psychological state was believed to have a direct physical impact. A woman who was cheerful and pious was thought to have an easier labor. Fear, anxiety, or a guilty conscience could physically obstruct the birth. This is why confession before labor was so important, to clear the spiritual and emotional pathways for the baby. Remedies often targeted the emotional state as much as the physical. Let's consider the case of a royal birth, such as that of Margaret Beaufort, mother of King Henry VII of England. She gave birth to her only child at the age of just 13. She was a small, young girl, and her body was not yet fully developed for childbirth. The labor was incredibly difficult and dangerous, and she and her son barely survived. The experience left her physically scarred for life, and she was never able to have another child. The progression of medical knowledge was agonizingly slow. For centuries, the teachings of Galen were treated as infallible doctrine, not as theories to be tested. To challenge Galen was to challenge the entire foundation of academic medicine. It wasn't until the 16th century that anatomists like Andreas Vesalius began to perform human dissections and systematically challenge the ancient texts. The concept of pain itself was understood differently. In our modern, secular world, pain is primarily seen as a negative signal from the body that something is wrong, a problem to be solved and eliminated. In the medieval world, pain had a purpose and a meaning. It was a crucible, a trial, a form of communication with the divine. The suffering of Christ on the cross was the ultimate model for this kind of redemptive pain. The physical environment of the birthing room was deliberately manipulated according to humoral theory. A woman's temperament was assessed. If she was considered to have a hot and dry nature, the room would be kept cool and moist. She might be given cooling foods like cucumber or melon. If she was cold and wet, the room would be heated, and she would be given warming foods and spices like ginger and pepper. In a corner, a pot of water steams over the hearth. It is for washing, for warming cloths, for making brews of raspberry leaf and lavender. It is a small bastion of comfort against a sea of overwhelming pain. The role of magic and superstition, distinct from religious faith, was deeply ingrained in birthing practices. While the church condemned magic, many folk beliefs persisted. An axe might be placed under the bed to cut the pain. All knots in the room, on ropes, clothing, or hair, had to be untied and all locks and doors unbolted to symbolize the opening of the womb and an easy passage for the child. Eagle stones, or etites, which were hollow geodes with a loose pebble inside, were believed to aid in delivery. What happened to the women who could not conceive? In a society that placed such a high value on fertility, infertility was a personal tragedy and a social stigma. It was almost universally blamed on the woman. A barren woman could be seen as cursed by God, or her womb might be considered too cold, too wet, or blocked. The very language used to describe childbirth reveals the medieval mindset. The woman was in travail, a word that means torturous, painful work. The midwife was a midwife, literally the with woman, emphasizing her role as a companion. The newborn child was often referred to as a stranger until it was baptized and formally brought into the Christian community. The process was not delivery in our passive sense, but an active, arduous struggle. The end of a successful birth was marked by specific rituals. Once the baby was cleaned and swaddled, a spoonful of honey might be placed on its tongue, a sweet welcome into the world and a taste of the promised land flowing with milk and honey. A celebratory meal known as the groaning feast would be prepared for the mother and her gossips. The groaning referred to the mother's cries in labor, and the feast was a reward for her endurance. We have a few surviving written accounts from medieval women about their childbirth experiences, though they are rare. One is from the English mystic Margery Kempe in the 15th century. She describes her first childbirth as a terrifying ordeal that nearly killed her and led to a profound spiritual crisis and visions. Another source is the Letters of the Paston Family, which discuss pregnancies, fears about childbirth, and the hiring of midwives. The development of printing in the 15th century had a slow but eventual impact on childbirth. The first printed manuals for midwives began to appear, such as Der Rosengarten, The Rose Garden by Eucherius Rösslin, published in 1513. This book, filled with woodcut illustrations, became a European bestseller and was translated into many languages. For the first time, the knowledge of midwives could be standardized and disseminated widely. The contrast between the ideal and the reality was stark. Religious art and literature often depicted the birth of Christ or other saints in a serene, clean, and painless manner. The Virgin Mary was shown kneeling in adoration before the newborn Jesus, having given birth miraculously without pain or mess, as befitted her purity. This idealized image stood in brutal contrast to the loud, sweaty, bloody reality of the typical medieval birthing chamber. The swaddling of the newborn was a universal and vital practice. Immediately after birth, the infant would be tightly wrapped from neck to toe in long strips of linen or wool cloth. This was done for several reasons. It was believed that a baby's limbs were soft and pliable, and that without swaddling, they would grow crooked. It was also a practical way to keep the baby warm, calm, and easy to handle. The baby would remain tightly bound for months, often only being unwrapped for cleaning. The legacy of this era is profound and long-lasting. The association of childbirth with sin and suffering, the exclusion of women from formal medical education, and the view of the female body as mysterious and flawed all had consequences that echoed for centuries. The struggle to make childbirth safer was not just a scientific battle, it was also a cultural and political one. Ultimately, the story of medieval childbirth is one of incredible resilience. It is a testament to the strength of women who faced an ordeal we can barely imagine, armed with little more than community, faith, and their own courage. They endured unimaginable pain, constant fear, and devastating loss, yet they continued to bring new life into the world. They were not passive victims of their time. They were active participants in one of life's most fundamental dramas.